Good morning. We're coming on the air with breaking news. NBC News has learned the first Israeli hostages, 3 women, have just been released by Hamas after nearly 16 months in captivity. The Israeli military says the hostages were handed over to the Red Cross just moments ago. Their freedom coming as part of a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas that went into effect this morning after a brief delay. Today's news marks the beginning of the first of 3 phases of the ceasefire deal, with each phase set to last several weeks. With phase 1 now underway, hostages are set to be released every 7 days until 33 have been freed, though it remains unclear right now if all of them are alive. For their part, the Israeli government will release dozens of Palestinian prisoners and send fresh aid into Gaza, with the fighting there now on hold. NBC's chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel is in Tel Aviv following this closely with us. Richard, what more can you tell us about this release of those 3 hostages?
So hopefully you can hear me. There is a lot of music here. There are celebrations going on here in Tel Aviv in what is called Hostage Square now. Yes, we can confirm from the Israeli military, from our sources in Gaza, that this transfer took place. It took place in Gaza City. There was a strong contingent of Hamas militants. They arrived masked, they arrived armed, they arrived in vehicles. Then they handed over to the Red Crescent those 3 female hostages, Romi Gonen, Doron Steinbecher, and Emily Damari. They were handed over to the Red Cross. The Red Cross then taking them to the Israeli military. They were greeted once inside Israel by their mothers, and then they will be flown. This process is underway right now to Tel Aviv, where they will receive medical treatment. So we can confirm that the process is still underway, but that they are now inside Israeli territory. So the first hostage transfer has been successful of this long process.
And, of course, long awaited for those mothers greeting the 3 young women ranging in age from 24 to 31. Do we know anything at this early stage, Richard, about the health of the 3 hostages who are now free?
They were all walking. We didn't get very many images of them. There had been some expectation that at least one of these young women would be potentially in a wheelchair. All of them seemed to be, at least at a first glance, to be in relatively good condition. Romi Gonen, as you mentioned, 24 years old. We have spoken over the process over this last 15 months with her family, with her mother. Her mother was there, Mirav, at the site to receive her once they crossed into Israel. She was kidnapped from the Nova Music Festival. She had been shot during her kidnapping, so she will clearly need medical condition. All of them will need medical condition. That's why they're being brought to a hospital here. The Israeli military has put both medical personnel on standby as well as psychological support. Doron Steinbecher from Kfar Aza, which is a kibbutz right on the border with Gaza. She was kidnapped from her home. She's a 31-year-old veterinary nurse known in her community as someone who always worked with animals, loved animals. And then Emily Damari, also kidnapped from her home in Kfar Aza. 28-year-old, described as a very popular member of the community, someone who loved barbecues, organizing social events, and now with their mothers on their way to medical treatment here in Tel Aviv.
And it has been nearly 16 months, as I mentioned, since the terrorist attack of October 7th that those 3 young women and many others have been in captivity. So, Richard, let's look at now what happens from here. As those hostages are cared for, Israelis looking forward to the release of 30 more in the coming weeks. What else will happen today on the other side of this deal?
So on the other side of the deal, as soon as this happens, first of all, in order to allow this to happen, the ceasefire went into effect several hours ago. So that means Israeli strikes on Gaza stopped, or at least paused for now, because Israel has said that it reserves the right to resume strikes on Gaza should this deal break down. So the ceasefire went into effect, so major military operations have at least been paused. The hostages, these first 3, have been transferred to Israel. This allows the process to continue. Aid trucks have been lining up on the edge of Gaza in order to bring more humanitarian relief to the 2.3 million people of Gaza. Also, this initiates the first stage of prisoner releases, and families in Gaza have been waiting, preparing their homes to receive their loved ones. Then the next phase of this process begins, which is preparations for the next batch of hostages. And as of now, that is supposed to take place in 1 week's time. And the expectation at this moment is that 4 more hostages will be released, also potentially 4 more women.
Richard Engel reporting from Tel Aviv this morning as 3 Israeli hostages now are with their families and undergoing medical evaluation and treatment inside Israel. Richard, thanks so much. Let's bring in NBC News contributor Jeremy Bash. He's a former chief of staff at the CIA and the Pentagon. Jerry, good morning. Jeremy, this was a fragile deal right up until this morning when there was a delay in the implementation of this prisoner exchange, of the return of the hostages from Hamas into Israel. What do you make of what we've seen so far?
Well, it's emotional. Obviously, there's incredible relief for the families, but it remains fragile, Willie, because if you examine the text of this carefully negotiated agreement between Hamas and between Israel, which the United States, the Biden administration, together with the incoming Trump team and the Qataris and the Egyptians had to hammer out over these last several weeks, the agreement means that 3 living hostages will come out today, the 3 women that Richard was just speaking about. And then there's a waiting period. And then on day 7, 4 additional living women are going to be released. And then at that time, Hamas will give Israel the total list of the initial 33 hostages who will come out in phase 1 over 42 days. Among those 33, we expect 2 Americans to be released. Keith Siegel, 65 years old, and Sagi Dek El-Chen, 36-year-old father of 3. There's a 3rd living American hostage, military-age male, Idan Alexander. He's not on the initial list, and there's concern that he will be held until a later phase because of his status as a, quote, healthy military-age male, if you can speak of someone in good health after 470 days in captivity. So 3 living Americans, and then the remains of 4 Americans who were murdered. Omer Nutra, Itai Chen, Gad and Judy Hagai. Those also need to be repatriated with their families until we can say all Americans, Willie, are home.
All right, Jeremy Bash, we appreciate your insight into this deal. Thanks so much. Meanwhile, both President Biden and President-elect Trump have been watching today's movements very closely, of course. Let's bring in Aaron Gilchrist at the White House with more on that. Aaron, what are you hearing?
Willie, good morning. We expect to hear from President Biden in the next few minutes here. The White House was scheduled a speech, remarks from him for 10:30 this morning. As he was leaving Washington, D.C., I can tell you he just landed in Charleston, South Carolina, where he's expected to speak at a church at the top of the hour. These remarks about this ceasefire deal and hostage release deal actually coming to fruition are remarks that were added to be before this speech that he's supposed to give at a church today. Of course, we know the Biden administration has been working for the better part of a year to bring together a deal that would result in the release of hostages and a stop to the fighting in Gaza. This is something that the president has spoken about over the last several days, being happy that this deal has finally come together. He reminded us that he put forth a proposal back in May of last year, and that the deal that ultimately came together last week was essentially the deal that he had put on the table in May of last year. And his team has been on the ground over the last several weeks trying to finalize this deal that ultimately really came together finally over the weekend, last weekend, and is now, as we've been seeing, Willie, being implemented today. We expect to hear from President Biden, hopefully in the next half hour.
Yeah, we expect to hear from him a short time from now what could be his last public remarks as President of the United States, as Donald Trump will be inaugurated for a second time just over 24 hours from now.
President Biden, on his last full day in office, is about to deliver remarks on the critical first stage of a ceasefire deal, which went into effect earlier this morning between Israel and Hamas, and the release of 3 Israeli hostages, who we've learned have now been handed over to the Red Cross. They are in custody of the Israeli Defense Forces. It is just nearly 6 p.m. in Tel Aviv. You are looking live now at the location where President Biden will speak. This is Hostage Square overseas, where jubilant crowds are celebrating. There is also a somber tone there. You see people hugging after word that those 3 female hostages have, in fact, been been released by Hamas. They are on their way out of Gaza after more than 15 months in captivity. In Gaza as well, celebrations that the fighting is over, at least for now. The Israeli Prime Minister's office confirmed the names of those 3 female hostages freed. They are 24-year-old Romi Gonen, 31-year-old Doron Steinbrecher, and 28-year-old Emily Damari. In exchange, Israel is expected to free Palestinian prisoners, although when that happens is still not clear at this moment. Israel will also supply humanitarian aid to Gaza. Today's hostage release and agreement now paves the way for the next phases of this deal. You saw the location where we expect to see President Biden. He is in South Carolina this morning. We'll listen into his remarks when they happen, but I want to start with Keir Simmons, who is joining us now. Keir, a critical moment for so many in the region.
Oh, so critical. And we're seeing these scenes of, you want to say, celebration. You might
and Keir,
just
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but President Biden is here speaking now. Let's listen in.
Has finally come to fruition. The ceasefire has gone into effect in Gaza, and today we're seeing hostages being released. 3 Israeli women held against their will in the dark tunnels for 470 days. 4 more women will be released in 7 days. 3 additional hostages every 7 days thereafter, including at least 2 American citizens in this first phase. We pray for them and their families, for they're going to be a long recovery ahead. By the 16th day of the deal, talks will begin in the second phase. This phase includes the release of Israeli soldiers and a permanent end of the war without Hamas in power or able to threaten Israel. Hundreds of trucks are entering Gaza as I speak. They're carrying assistance for civilians who suffered enormously from the war that Hamas started on October 7, 2023, nearly 15 months ago. Today alone, we anticipate several hundred trucks will enter the Gaza Strip as I'm speaking. And after so much pain, destruction, loss of life, today the guns in Gaza have gone silent. This was the deal that I outlined for the world back in May 31st. Many of you covered it at the time. It was endorsed overwhelmingly by folks around the world, including the UN Security Council, unanimously endorsed the deal, and developed in coordination with Egypt, Qatar, and Israel. I've worked in foreign policy for decades, and this is one of the toughest negotiations I've been part of. Many of you who follow these negotiations will attest that the road to this deal has been not easy at all, and a long road. But we've reached this point today because of the pressure Israel built on Hamas, backed by the United States. Some said my policy of a firm support for Israel was relentlessly pursuing diplomacy, risked drawing America into a wider war in the region. I listened to those voices, many of whom I respected a great deal, but I concluded abandoning the course I was on would not have led us to the ceasefire we're seeing today. But instead, it would have risked a wider war in the region that so many feared. Now the region has been fundamentally transformed. Hamas's longtime leader, Sinwar, is dead. Hamas sponsors in the Middle East have been badly weakened by Israel, backed by the United States. Hezbollah, one of Hamas's biggest backers, was significantly weakened on the battlefield, and its leadership was destroyed. Even as we worked for diplomatic solutions in Lebanon, we provided ongoing assistance and supported Israel's military campaign against Hezbollah, including its efforts to take out the terror infrastructure along the border between Israel and Lebanon. Israel's campaign was extremely successful, so much so that by the end of November, the United States had brokered a ceasefire in Lebanon. Hezbollah did what it said it would never do. It cut its deal and abandoned Hamas. And today, in Lebanon, there's finally a new president and prime minister, both of whom support a sovereign Lebanon without Hezbollah running the show or playing any part in it. The Assad regime next door in Syria is gone, removing Iran's ready access to Lebanon. Iran is in the weakest position in decades after the U.S. military helped defend Israel from Iranian missiles and supported Israel's military response inside Iran. Just look across the region. In Lebanon, there's an opportunity for a future free from the grip of Hezbollah. In Syria, a future free from the tyranny of Assad. For the Palestinian people, a credible path to a state of their own. And for the region and the future normalization and integration of Israel with all its Arab neighbors, including Saudi Arabia, who I've spoken with. You know, we've had many difficult days since Hamas began this terrible war. We've encountered roadblocks and setbacks, but we haven't given up. And a special thanks to my team, particularly Brett McGurk, who many of you know, who spent weeks and months working nonstop to reach this deal. Many of those weeks and months out of the country. Today's ceasefire in Gaza and the release of hostages is a result of a principled and effective policy that we presided over for months. And we got here without a wider war in the Middle East than many predicted. And now it falls on the next administration to help implement this deal. I was pleased to have our team speak as one voice in the final days. It was both necessary and effective and unprecedented. But success is going to require persistence and continuing support for our friends in the region and the belief in diplomacy backed by deterrence. So as we reflect on the news from Gaza today, we also remember all the victims of this war. We're mindful that the pursuit of a lasting peace, while never easy or quick, must always be our calling. So thank you all for listening. May God bless you all. May God protect our troops. I'm looking forward to this deal being fully implemented. And I'm sorry I'm not going to take any questions now because I'm waiting. There's a whole congregation waiting for me. And I'm sure the remainder of the day I'll have an opportunity to speak with you. Thank you very much.
Anything about the condition of the hostages that were released today and the others?
Yes, I've just got a call saying the 3 are released into Gaza to the out of the hands of their captors, and they appear to be in good health, but it's early to tell. They may be across the border out of the Gaza Strip into Israel now. I'm not certain. Thank you.
Sir, any concerns about Hamas regrouping?
No.
Will you remain involved in the deal as it moves forward?
No way out. Proud of the deal.
President Biden there taking a couple of questions on his way out of that room in South Carolina, as you heard him talk about what this moment means for the region and that he understands that those 3 women hostages just released are in good health. I want to go to our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, who is live for us in Tel Aviv. A critical moment for so many around the world here.
People here have been watching, some applauding, some crying, a very emotional moment. There have just been speeches and a statement given by the Israeli military that the 3 of them are inside Israeli territory, that they are safe, that these 3 young women were greeted by their mothers, that they are receiving initial medical care, that in the coming days and the next phases of this process, each week it is expected that 3 to 4 more hostages will be released. So this is just the start of the process, Holly.
Richard Engel live for us there in Tel Aviv from Hostage Square, a location where over the course of the last 400-plus days, people have gathered, people have come to bear witness and to show their support for those hostages still in Gaza. A critical moment for both Israel and Gaza. We will have much more coverage coming up throughout the day. That concludes this NBC News special report. I'll have much more ahead tonight on Nightly News. For all of us here at NBC, thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.